Great, thank you for the introduction. As you've mentioned, my name is Howard, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of my research on the Clarence Formation. I'm going to do a bit of a background, going to go into some aims, methodologies, and then I'm going to share some exciting findings from our field work. Okay, so let's go. So as you know, the Clarence Formation is part of the Stormberg group within the Karoo supergroup, and our study focuses on the main Karoo basin of Southern Africa. The Clarence Formation is underlain by the Elliott Formation, overlain by the Drakensberg group, and is well known as a Jurassic aeolianite and a vast desert system in the Jurassic of Southern Africa. It has a thickness of roughly 10 to 300 meters, although a 150 meter thickness is more representative across the basin. Lacustrine and fluvial processes have been identified by previous studies of the Clarence Formation, specifically those of Nick Beekes in the late 1960s and Patrick Erickson. And the regional study of Nick Beekes, he identified 3 vertical zones within the Clarence Formation, informally subdivided based on the appearance of large-scale cross-bedding in the middle zone that is sandwiched between a massive lower and a massive upper zone. Within the Clarence Formation, a west to east wind regime is also prevalent and was prevalent during the time of deposition of the Clarence Formation, and this interpreted from the 4 set beds of the large-scale cross beds. All right, so despite these overall studies, there's a general lack of understanding of the detail of lacustrine and fluvial interactions in these desert systems. And with this in mind, the aims of the project will be to do a regional and systematic study of the fascies and to map these 3D anatomy of the fascies. In addition, we will also be doing a environmental reconstruction at high resolution of these aeolian fluvial environments, and also to evaluate the sedimentary processes on various timescales. And this might give us some insights to the regional climate of Southern Gondwana and compared to the global climate models for the early Jurassic. This will be done using the well-known fascies analysis technique, which is done by documenting various sedimentary features such as grain size, sedimentary structures, lithology, composition, as well as the upper and overlying fascies contacts. We will also be logging the sediments to get an understanding of the thickness changes throughout the basin, as well as the changes in sediments. And we will also be doing a petrographic analysis and also a chronostratigraphic framework for the Clarence Formation using the detrital zircon geochronology, specifically laser ablation ICP-MES to date these zircons. At this point in time, we've already finished all the field work, collected all the samples, and the samples have been processed, and we're progressing well with evaluating these fascies. And I'm just going to go through some of the findings now. So we've identified lacustrine fascies within 3 sites of the Clarence Formation. As you can see, site 1, the Makanyaneng site in northern Lesotho, then in southern Lesotho, the Makopa site, and then the Petkani Glen site in Eastern Cape of South Africa, close to the town of Berkeley East. What I want you to note particularly here is the position of these sites relative to the erg margin, which would have been situated on the south and southeast of the Clarence Formation. Okay, then if we look at the sedimentary logs, we can see as we move from A to B to C, there's a change from erg center towards the erg margin. And with this change, we do see a change in thickness of these lacustrine fascies, as well as a change in complexity. But now we'll have a look at the specific detail of each site. So firstly, we'll start with the Makanyaneng type. The Makanyaneng type comprises laminated gray to dark gray siltstones that are bounded by large-scale crossbeds. The surface onto which the siltstones were deposited do preserve ripple marks, as well as ripple marks and desiccation cracks on a dune slope that can be traced into this siltstone feature. The overlying fascies are shown to, you can see here, those are wavy laminated sandstones. And when you look at the detail close up, we can see that there's a change from laminated siltstones to wavy laminated sandstones to wavy laminated and large-scale cross-bedded sandstones with a close spatial relationship. And this then shows a transition from wet to damp to dry deposition for the specific site. So overall, this means that the Makanyaneng type represents small isolated ponds that form in dune hollows and as a result of rising water tables. And because of the high wind speeds and high sediment availability in a berg center, migrating dunes were able to fairly rapidly close all of these isolated ponds. All right, the second type is that of the Makopa type. This is characterized by laterally extensive laminated and massive siltstone with minor interbedded stacked sandstones. These again are sandwiched between large-scale crossbeds, and similar to the previous one, the basal surface onto which the siltstones were deposited do preserve various kinds of ripple marks, including interference ripples, and also lenticular massive sandstones associated with the basal crossbeds that do indicate some sort of mass movement that represents reworking of the dunes. Then looking just here, we can see these laminated siltstone, these stacked ripple mark surfaces, which do indicate this occurs at the edge of the towards the edge of these siltstones. So when looking at these specific outcrops, we can see the geometry of the lake site in the outcrop having a thick middle that tapers out towards the edges. And then also just you can see the lateral extent roughly 500 meters in lateral extent. Just looking from, just this picture at the bottom is taken from this site here at the south, looking north, and we can see this low relief surface that these siltstones were deposited on, as well as those stacked ripple mark surfaces that do crop out also towards the edge of these siltstones. So what does this mean? Overall, the Makopa type does represent initial isolated lakes that were not connected, but through reworking of the interdune and the dune field itself, created a low relief surface where the pond formed. All right, then lastly, the Fetkani glen type is again bound by large-scale cross-bedding that we see at the top here and here. And this is also characterized by massive to laminated siltstones that do show interbedding of horizontal, massive, and low-angle crossbeds that we see in this part here. And these form quite prominent features on the landscape. And using these prominent features, we were able to map the entirety of the Fetkani glen lake type. And it shows it has roughly a diameter of roughly 8 to 10 kilometers. So quite a big lake site for this aeolian system. Again, the basal surface onto which the siltstones were deposited preserve ripple marks, and the interbedded massive sandstones preserve bed bottom structures such as drag casts and load cast as well. We also identified hummocky cross stratification in some of these lake sediments, which reflect storm wave action within these shallow lakes. We also identified various charcoal and plant fragments within these sediments. Here we can see microcharcoal, some mesocharcoal, as well as plant fragments. And then in a site about 1.5 kilometers northeast of the initial main study site, we identified sandstone bedding plane features such as dendritic roll marks, possible fly traces, symmetrical ripple marks, as well as adhesion structures, and also internal sandstone structures that of wavy lamination, which again points towards adhesion processes. And overall, these show lake margin processes during deposition of the lake deposits. So overall, the Fetkani glen lake type reflects an extensive interdunal lake that was extensive enough where precipitation-related flood events allowed for hyper-concentrated flows to enter these lake bodies, as we see in this illustration here. All right, then overall, microbial activity has been shown to be present in all of these lake studies that we've all these sites that we've studied, and this in the form of microbially induced sedimentary structures. Here we can see some wrinkle marks as well as mat roll-up structures, and then some deformation structures that do indicate cohesive behavior of the substrate, which also then indicate points towards a substance like microbial mats that would have caused that deformation. We've also identified a microbial surface texture, which is similar to modern day microcollia species that has been identified in similar inland lakes. At this point, I would also like to point out, and you might have also noticed, that there's a general lack of desiccation features in all of these lake facies. And this does indicate that these so-called wet periods were prolonged, prolonged events, and they might have been related to the development of bypass supersurfaces in the Aeolian system. So why are these lakes significant? So firstly, we do know that Aeolian systems are very sensitive to climatic fluctuation, and these interdunal deposits capture these sediments that show these climatic fluctuations. And secondly, we know that these lake sites also sustain thriving local ecosystems. And this is also seen from the diverse fossil assemblage that we see in the Clarence Formation. And this then brings us to the age of the Clarence Formation. So the Clarence Formation is currently shown to be Sinomurian to Pliensbachian in age. And this is based on bio and chronostratigraphic constraints, but that are specifically related to the conformably underlying red beds. And then the upper constraint is based on the radiometric dating of the conformably overlying Karuba salts at roughly 183 million years. So keeping this in mind, we sampled various locations throughout the Clarence Basin, and then also sampled each stratigraphic zone, as I mentioned in the intro, just to get a good spatiotemporal representation of all the Clarence Formation. So in total, 21 samples were analyzed, of which 12 gave successful results. And this gives us an average age per zone as follows. Zone 1 having a maximum depositional age of 191.9. Zone 2 having a maximum depositional age of 189.48. And Zone 3 having a maximum depositional age of 187.3. So overall, these results do confirm the previously mentioned constraints, confirming that the Clarence Formation does conform to the Sinomurian Pliensbachian late early Jurassic age as per the constraints that were given. So at this point, I will also just note or emphasize that this is preliminary results. So I'm still busy with this. So don't quote me on this yet, but watch the space. Yeah, it's gonna, once we finish the work, we will publish the results and make it available. So yeah, just a heads up. And just to give you some stratigraphic context within the zones and the locations that were sampled, I've just broken down a simple log that just shows the thickness as well as the zone per sampled area. And we can see zone 1 in green, zone 2 in yellow, and then zone 3 in blue. And you can see again, as I mentioned, the thickness being quite variable for the Clarence Formation. In addition to the chronostratigraphic framework that we intend on doing, the zircon data will also be used for provenance studies. And again, I'm going to say still work in progress, but based on the kernel density estimates, we can already see that I've broken them down into the zones, and we can already see that for each zone, the provenance remains quite consistent for the Clarence Formation, having major peaks at roughly 250 million years, 500 million years, as well as 1 billion years. Okay, so in conclusion, the overall desert setting in this vast Southern African Jurassic desert does show evidence for repeated and prolonged periods of wet conditions. And this may be related to the development of bypass supersurfaces within this Aeolian system. The size of the lakes are quite variable and also vary depending on their position relative to the Erg margin. And then finally, the preliminary maximum depositional ages do appear to be consistent with other biostratigraphic and chronostratigraphic constraints that we see for the Clarence Formation. So just ending off, thank you very much. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the Geological Society of South Africa and the REI Fund for supporting this project. I would also like to thank UCT as well as the Center Excellence in Paleosciences for bursary funding. Then also the National Research Foundation, the Paleontological Scientific Trust, the Geological Society of America, and the Society for Sedimentary Geology for supporting various components of this research. And then finally, I would just like to thank my colleagues, friends and colleagues at UCT for generously giving the time and assisting me with fieldwork. So I think that brings me to an end. If there's any questions, did I rush through this?
No, that was great.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Howard. Thanks for that well-illustrated presentation. Are there any
sharing?
Yes. Well, keep it on.
See if there's questions. Maybe there's questions.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So are there any questions for Howard? Please put up the hand. Or if you can't find your hand, just unmute yourself, then we'll give you an opportunity to ask your question. Rainy, please go ahead, sir.
The provenance ages were very interesting. What were the provenance areas? Where were they?
Rainy, at this stage, as I've mentioned, it's still ongoing, but from previous studies, it's been speculated that it's a combination of pre-Karoo and Karoo ages that we see coming through here, but also some older as well, but definitely recycled sediments of various kinds. Okay. Question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. But as I've said, that's based on previous work, but we are still underway with this. And once we've got a better handle on it, we can definitely share that.
One question for me. Are there some examples of some modern analogs of this environment?
Yes, there are. So what we've related it to is the Bardane Jaran Desert in China, as well as perhaps the Lake Chad area in Western Africa also. Yeah, so if you check on Google Earth, you'll see that there's or even just Google Bardane Jaran Desert, you can see some really cool modern analogs of this, with some mega dunes, very big dunes also. Cool, you happy with that?
Safisa, George has got a question in the chat.
Yes, so George's question is, how do the fish get into the lakes?
Okay, yeah, that's probably, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a biologist, but I would assume sort of the eggs somehow make their way into these settings. And there are, in a lot of desert environments, you do find these fish that can survive without water for quite some time. So, but to answer your question, I'm not exactly sure. Not a biologist.
All right, thanks. Ian, you had unmuted yourself. Did you have a question? I'll get back to you, Rainy. Ian?
Yes, my question is, why no desiccation cracks ever? I'm still trying to understand. Are you saying that all of those environments that are preserved were underwater at the time? Or
yeah,
when deposition occurred? And surely you'd expect some time to find desiccation cracks.
Yes. Okay. So what we have seen is that there is no indication of desiccation for these specific sites. Whether that is just a preservation issue or it actually really is the case, my thinking is that it is actually the case, because when you have these humid phases combined with sort of the subsidence and sort of the subsidence and accommodation space created for this, you would have enough space to actually have enough subaqueous deposition to cause no desiccation at all, which we do seeing. And bear in mind, the thicknesses that we're seeing in the southern part of the basin is extreme for this kind of deposit.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Rainy, do you have another question? We still have a lot of time since your presentation was short. No, that's fine. We can.
I timed myself on 20 minutes and then I just rushed through it.
No, it's good. Rather not go over. But Rainy,
Okay.
do you have another question?
Yes, please. Putting up my groundwater hat, water levels are very important to us as geohydrologists, and I think
Yes.
these are some of the oldest water level records we have. Do you have any elevations for those lakes, perhaps? Then we can get a water level of 190 million years ago.
Yes. I can't tell you exactly the exact elevation, but I mean, yeah, one can go and measure it, I guess. The real question is it still, yeah, how relevant is it today, the water level of then? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there may have been some uplift or
Yes,
whatever, we don't know. But it's
Exactly,
a very
yeah.
similar system as you see in the Natal coastal areas, Zululand coastal areas,
Oh,
all
cool.
those lakes, Sabaya, and many of the other lakes there, exactly the same system. It's a lake in a dune system, which represents the groundwater level of the surrounding areas.
Yes, yeah, no, it's very interesting. Very similar, except that it's closer to the coast, which might have a, I'm not going to speculate, but yeah, these do appear to be very much groundwater controlled, as well as the humid phases that we see. But also given the distance that it actually goes into the earth, we also do speculate that it's very much humid phase controlled rather than actual water coming in from outside that controls the water levels. Anyway, but that's, yeah, I don't know if I can compare, like my groundwater knowledge is not that great. So, yeah. Any other questions, or did I answer your question, Rainy, or was it more of a comment?
Yes, no, thank you. It's sometimes very difficult to explain to people why there are lakes in these dune areas. They don't understand it's a natural groundwater level. It was like that 200 million years ago. So
yeah, I mean, we see it in the lake sediments, or in the Aeolian system. Yeah. Cool, but thank
George,
you.
Okay, thank you. George, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks, Howard, for a very good talk.
Okay, thanks.
Howard, did you get a chance to look right at the top of the formation at the contact with the Drakensberg volcanics and see the change from the volcanics to the sandstones that you were studying? I'm asking because of this controversial paper that's just been published recently in the South African Journal of Geology to claim that the volcanics were deposited in relatively deep water, but they overlie what you just described as a desert environment.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you can imagine my shock when I read that paper and I was like, ooh, am I missing something? Okay, but my comment will just be, we've got a paper in the review at the moment that is addressing this situation. And I would recommend that you look at that, but the essence of it is we do find evidence that there's no gap between the deposition of which we know from the literature as well, deposition of the Clarence Formation and the outpouring of the Karoo basalts. And in this paper, we do look at what we see is the pillar basalts that actually deform underlying sediments of the Clarence Formation and do indicate that there is sort of like very much interaction between those two environments, which then does suggest that there is that they couldn't have that there's no validity really to that statement, I feel. But again, I'm going to refer you to this paper that we have that's in press at the moment, or in review at the moment. And once that comes out, you can have a look at that and addresses this question directly that you asked.
Thank you very much.
Does that help you, or do you want more detail?
No, that's fine. We'll wait for the paper.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So wait then all the controversial papers. Anyway, there was Xavier. Do you want to just elaborate on your question? You can unmute yourself. There's a question there on the chat, just adding to Rainy's observation.
Okay.
We have a bit of time, so don't worry.
No, you can ask away. I've never had this many questions ever, so I'm loving this.
No, it's good. Xavier Middleton, would you like to ask? So it says that's an interesting observation, but how would you investigate that? Surely be confined, but what's actually preserved in the geological record? I think the alternative way to go forward would be to try to look at the geochem of those ancient water systems, question mark. Okay.
Yeah.
Xavier says, I've got the little ones running around. We don't mind, we understand. It's the ways of working nowadays, but would you like to comment on that?
Well, I mean, for some reason, there seems
More
to be
a question
about groundwater and things. I mean, yes, we're limited to what we can see preserved. And based on that, we can just make the best interpretations that we have. And from what I've seen, I do believe that these do actually reflect continuous and prolonged water deposition or subaqueous deposition. But that's about as much as I can say. The project at this stage is a field-based project. I'm not a geochemist, so I won't actually go about yet, at least, doing the geochemical analysis on that, but it would pose an interesting research project, I guess, yeah.
Okay. Rainy, before we close off on the questions, any comments to that, perhaps?
I'm just wondering what geochemistry would you look at? Geochemistry of the sandstones, or there's no water left there?
I don't know. Could be the siltstones. I'm not sure exactly. As I say, I'm not a geochemist, but I know this geochemistry of sediments become very tricky because because of the preservation issues and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure.
The other problem may be that currently those dune systems have got very good quality water, so the salt content is normally very low. And it may pose a problem for geochemistry with low concentrations of salts.
Okay. So the modern day water might influence the chemistry of those rocks.
Maybe I'm also not a geochemist,
again,
so
I'm not a
geochemist. I can't comment on that.
Yeah, maybe there might be a technique to distinguish, but that's a good point. Yeah, that might cloud. Okay.
Okay, cool.
Wonderful. No, great. Thank you. Thanks again, Howard, for that.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, everyone. I enjoyed this, and thank you for your thoughtful questions.
Okay, so this is the title of my talk, Time Trip South Africa, Marketing Geoheritage in South Africa. And this is a project that has been developing for a long time, and I'm very excited to be working with the Geological Society on it as well, and to really strengthen some weaknesses that we had in our project before, and I'm going to tell you about that now. So the aims of our project are to stimulate interest in the geosciences in South Africa. And geosciences, I mean geology, a bit of geography, paleontology, and even some archaeology, to provide basic information on geoscience-related topics, and most importantly, to increase visitor numbers to geotourism sites in South Africa. And I hope you can see these are very simple, but I mean, if you can stimulate interest in the geosciences, then maybe you can attract more people into studying geology. And to get them to do that, they need to know more about basic information on geoscience-related topics. And once they bought into the geosciences, they're more likely to visit geotourism sites. So everything is kind of interlinked. And this project, though, what we want to do is, over the past couple of years, starting in about 2015, we started developing an exhibit which grew into something called the Maze of Time. Okay, and we want to add a geological component to this traveling exhibition. And also, we want to market geotourism and add an online component, so you can actually access it via the internet. Because, of course, Up until 2019, I was super busy with traveling around the country with the Maze of Time and traveling exhibitions and making contact with people. But now with COVID, all of that has stopped. So I'm hoping next year, maybe things will return more or less back to normal. But I just know that in the future, if you're going to want to do outreach and science communication, you are going to have to go online. And there's no question about it. And of course, there are very exciting ways of doing that, virtual reality and all sorts of new technology that's coming along. All right, so just a little bit about the Maze of Time exhibition. So it's a traveling exhibition. Started work on it in 2015, all the way to 2019, where we actually managed to reach about 350,000 people. And over the time, it's won a few awards. It's got a strong educational component that was designed with input from educators. And we attracted our numbers. We went down to the Eastern Cape, to Southeast Africa. We did the Rand Show, the Yebo Khocha, which is just a local exhibition at Wits University. And we took aspects of it to kind of weird exhibitions like Comic-Con Africa, where they do comics and people dress up and they play computer games, and the Rage Expo, which is also a computer game expo. But if you know about computer games, you know there are quite a few where you travel back in time and fight with dinosaurs, and Minecraft is one particularly geologically orientated one. So there's a kind of niche audiences that you can attract and make stimulate their interest in the geosciences. And maybe even if the adults aren't interested, their kids will be. And of course, this was a partnership between ESI, COE, Paleosciences, the Albany Museum, and many others. Many people and organizations contributed to all this work over the years. All right, so a little bit more about it, and I'm just telling you about the maze so that you can see what the gap is for adding the geology to it. All right, so firstly, what we do is it can actually be quite big, sort of 20 by 30 meters, 10 by 20 meters, depending on how much space you've got. And you just get press boards, create a maze out of them, cover them with black shade cloth, dim the lights if you can. The photograph on the right isn't a very good example. And then people can wander through and look at posters, giving information, exhibitions. You can have nice samples, reconstructions of dinosaurs or whatever in there. So it's a bit of an exciting thing for them to do, because they never know what's going to come next. And although it's not a maze where you can get lost, you can make it intricate enough to make it interesting. And now we have got our different information posters, right? So we have got different components to this maze of time. And so one component is we just got simple information posters, like how old is the Earth? Is climate change real? And mass extinctions, which are kind of big topics that we have at the moment. And of course, you'd be shocked at how many people don't accept that the Earth is around about 4.5 billion years old. Never mind the climate change denialists and our concern with the sixth extinction at the moment. So we've got basic information. And then we have this time journey, this journey through time. And we start actually with the Big Bang and the origin of the universe. We go through the solar system, how the Earth forms, the first life, all the way up until fairly modern times with the origin of human culture. And we either use copyright-free pictures that we can get from the internet or that we can get from people, but we're actually very fortunate to have Maggie Newman's art. Ooh, where did that? To fall back on, and she has made all her artwork available to us to sort of use in posters where it's relevant. So we can put together quite a nice visual idea. And the whole point of each of these posters is, it's like you are standing on the Earth 3.5 billion years ago. What would you see? What would you feel? What would it be like? And what evidence do we have today to tell you what life was like in the past? So it's kind of to get people to really imagine what it would be like if they were traveling through time. And then we've got kind of more inspirational posters. I mean, we are living in Africa, the origin of humanity, tools, art, and fire. And I think people need to know that it was in Africa that everything and so much began and then spread out around the world. So there's an element of African pride here in what we as Africans have done and contributed to the world. All right, and then it's not just a static exhibition. We've got different activities. Yeah, we've got a preparator in the top left-hand corner from the Evolutionary Studies Institute with a microscope showing kids how you prepare fossils, a sand pit where they're digging up casts. This girl is getting her face painted with ochre and white clay, so you can immediately see the minerals and there's a geological connection. And these kids here are trying to solve dinosaur puzzles. And also we have a lot of fun creating worksheets that we give to kids as they go through the exhibition to sort of get them to ask questions. This one was a time detective worksheet. So basically the kids were told that a criminal has escaped and he's gone back into the past to avoid capture, and he's left clues behind in that exhibition. And we had little plastic packets stuck on the posters. There were cigarette stompies and footprints and all sorts of things. And then they had to go through, look at the posters, find those clues, and hopefully read the posters. There were questions as well to do with the content, and then come back, look at the suspects and tell us which one they thought was the person that they needed to capture. And of course, we have real objects, and because of the paleontological orientation of the exhibition so far, we've had fossils and casts and also archaeology, some archaeology, nice stone tools and things like that. And you can see we've got students, and actually the students love explaining the exhibition to the student, to the visitors, and lecturers, of course, with a microscope. This is Frank Neumann showing off pollen to the kids, and they really love it. And there's so much more you could do with this kind of thing. And these are real fossils from the Devonian. So this is kind of if I remember rightly, a little coelacanth, a baby coelacanth from Waterloo Farm in Makanda. And our reconstructions, yeah, they are. This is Fang, the Afrovenator, Therapsids from the Karoo. And what's lovely about a maze, if you've got something scary or spectacular, you can put it in a dark corner with a curtain and lights. So as you suddenly arrive on it and see this dinosaur there, it creates a lot of drama. And yeah, two more of our dinosaurs. This is our latest one called Afrovenator that we had on show at a computer gaming exhibition, and he's much improved now. This is really a rough draft. All right, so that's the exhibition. And the idea is, well, why not add more geology, promote geotourism, and how do you put this online? And also use that online version to create a portal to all the other sites and all the other things that people are doing, promoting geoheritage in South Africa. So just some thoughts. We've got our information posters, right? So how old is the Earth? I mean, you could have rock types, volcanoes, earthquakes, structure of the Earth. I'm just thinking of ideas, and I know you'll think of many more. Plate tectonics. We've got a small one, but you would be shocked at how many people in South Africa, if you tell them, did you know, well, that the continents are riding on the back of plates and they've been moving around, and over time would say, what? The continents move? Many, many. I think it could be an interesting survey to find out. You could have a poster on what do geoscientists do, careers in geosciences, many more. The only restriction is it needs to fit on an A0 poster, And you don't want too much information, because in this type of exhibition, it's very easy to overload people. So you want to kind of attract them to an idea, get a big idea, and then maybe just put a little bit more information to stimulate them to kind of read up further on for themselves. Your time travel posters, well, we need more stops. So we could have a stop on the Witwatersrand, Vredefort Impact, Bushveld Complex, Kimberlite Eruption at Kimberley. You could choose anyone. Or in general, the Tswang event. And again, I think you would have more ideas of the new stops that we could add. But the other weakness of our posters is that they need more geology. This is the poster on Barberton, for example. So yeah, we just talk about life really, and we show off a slide showing bacteria in a rock, and we discuss tremololites a little bit. But I mean, you could have komatiites, you could have those ancient beaches, life on the ancient beaches, many more that I've become aware of, just to strengthen geology. And it might actually end the geology and how you use the geology to reconstruct the past. And in the end, you might even need 2 posters for some of the sites, just to let people know what it was like better and how geology has contributed to our reconstruction of that particular time. That stop in time. And then African innovations that have changed the world, and ancient African innovations. Well, we have the earliest mine in the world here nearby. Surely a poster on that. And again, I think you would be able to think of many more that we could add. So we've got tools, fire, culture, humanity. So many things have come out of Africa. So why not add mining and other things? And then this isn't part of this project, but really you could have a large model of a volcano, earthquake shake table. You could develop worksheets and puzzles and display beautiful rock samples, many other things that you could do that would be as spectacular and as fun as dinosaurs and mammal-like reptiles and that kind of thing. All right. So now I'm going to go on to the last component, which is the promoting of the geotourism and the geoheritage. And I just put this in, it's a bit crowded, but it's just a little bit of background. I mean, we're all passionate about geoheritage in different ways. We look at different aspects of it, and they could be landscapes, places of scientific interest, historical or cultural interest, sacred significance. And over the years, there's been a lot of work compiling sites that are of special value and registering them with UNESCO, with the government, or whoever to have them protected. And kind of actually just setting up a directory and compiling this list has been a major task. They could be iconic rock crops, collections of outcrops, a beautiful natural feature or landscape. You can read fossil-rich sites, older mines, sacred sites of religious significance, which is unusual, but I know that the caves in town are used by sort of Christian sects. They're used by religious, traditional healers. They're even used by Rastas for their ceremonies. And they could be geoheritage site, the World Heritage Site, the Natural History Museum, or there's so many of them. But for this project, the focus really is to be on geotourism. In other words, out of all those different sites that have been identified and are being set up, we want to focus on those that are currently operating and trying to attract tourists. Well, that was before COVID, right? At the moment, everybody's very quiet, but it's not going to stay that way forever. So a geotourism site could be a natural history museum or an exhibition center. I mean, something like that center at Moropeng, a geoheritage site, any place that has been developed for geotourism. And the sad factor is that if a place has not got government sponsorship in this country, it is very unlikely to be sustainable. And that is our experience. I just did some more informal research in 2016 and looking at all the natural history museums, all the big ones from Cape Town, Pretoria, Bloemfontein. Everybody together attracted less than 1 million people. And if they didn't have sponsorship, really, they wouldn't be able to operate in the way that they do. I personally have experience of managing the Kitchen Fossil Exploration Center down in the Eastern Cape with Bruce Rubridge and many others. And over the 10, 12, 15 years that we've been operating, it has been a struggle to keep that center running and sustainable. This is a guide from that center in that picture, showing tourists around, and at his feet this is a fossil, and he's explaining to them how big it was. But to keep these guys in jobs, and we had to lay off 2 because of COVID, and to sort of keep them being paid even vaguely decent salaries, let's not mention benefits or anything like that, is a struggle. So that's why we want to add to the Maze of Time a semi-independent or independent exhibition on geotourism. All right, so this is what, now I'm going to talk about the geotourism exhibition. So what we're looking at, and if you just look at the picture there, is the way we think it's going to work is that it's going to be sort of laid out in an arc or a horseshoe. And in the center, there's going to be a central map. We're looking at a big map, sort of 3.2 meters by 2 meters. And it's going to be a geological map. And it's going to show off the various localities, the geotourism sites that we have chosen to promote. And then around here, sort of on this side of it and that side of it, there are going to be posters, A0 posters. Maybe we're going to mount the whole thing on vinyl, just print them straight onto vinyl, and which can be supported by an aluminium concertina type frame. We're hoping it's going to be possible for the whole exhibition to do this. Otherwise, when it comes to the logistics, we might have to change the design a bit. And then with regard to the posters, we sort of see 2 types. Posters representing geotourism sites that represent more or less a single time period or era or whatever you want to call it. And then multiple site posters where, like a natural history museum, where they have a variety of exhibits that cover a broad spectrum of times. And you'll see a little bit why we make the distinction. So we're going to have a large geological map, A0 posters marketing sites representing a narrow time period, then those representing natural history museums, etc., which cover more than time period, and then the online component. And so each poster is going to have a QR code, which if you scan with your cell phone, will connect to the website we're going to set up to, and other websites that we choose to kind of link in. And the other thing about the website, it's going to have all the materials available. People will be able to download them and use them, print them out and use them for their own purposes, if they so choose. All right, so here our A0 map is. Okay, 3.5 by 2 meters, so it is going to be big. It's going to have a simplified geological map and then some graphics. It's going to have a geological strata and then just an arrow pointing to the site and giving you an idea of where you are in the geological timescale. And these are our time-specific sites. We thought of 15 of them, and with your input, we can change that. These aren't set in stone. Maybe there's some geological sites that we've left out. We have scope to reduce the number of posters or increase the number of posters. But the point is to keep the whole exhibition manageable and not too overwhelming for the visitor. So firstly, obviously, we're going to have an introduction to SA's geoheritage. We're looking at the Barberton Makonyoa Geo Trail. Witwatersrand is a difficult one because although there's been so much history here, there don't seem to be that many sites. So we thought of Crown Mine, number 14 Shaft is maybe one. And then there's maybe that museum in Roodepoort that I've never visited. And this is what we'd really be looking for advice on, or to look at. Well, how would we best represent this? The Vredefort Dome, the Waterloo Farm, that's all the Devonian, that's the Devonian site where they found those four-legged fish. The Karoo with its flood basalts, mammal ancestors. There's our Kitchen Fossil Exploration Center, the Karoo National Park, for example. They're building a new museum at the Golden Gate National Park. I believe it's almost finished, which will look at dinosaurs mainly. The Kimberley Big Hole Museum, you've got that Kimbalite eruption to talk about. Then the Mazamba Forests and Petrified Forest in Port Edward, the West Coast Fossil Park, Swine Meteorite Crate, Cradle of Humankind. And then down in the Cape, we have got early human culture at Blombos Museum and Pinnacle Point Nature Reserve. And there are actually quite a few, if we wanted to look at the archaeology that we could mention, all with their own wonderful discoveries in early human culture. Then we've got rock art and engravings, sand art, for example, from Giant's Castle. And then lastly, we could finish with the Iron Age. And like I said, this list is open for discussion. And I'm sure there are many sites that we could put in or discuss how best to include. Right, and I just wanted to show you, which I think is actually important. This is a draft poster that we produced here for the Barberton Makonyoa Geo Trail. And this is what we thought for the time-specific sites. So we're going to have stops. These are stops in time as well to relate to the time traveling. And you've got to have a map showing where it is in the geological column. This is basic information about the site. So this is drive yourself 27 kilometers, or maybe you want to take a guide. There are 12 visit stops with beautiful signage that tell you what it was like there, what it was like at that place a couple of billion years ago. Then along the top, some of the attractions and rocks and geological attractions there and how they're interpreted and what evidence they give us. And then we've got a then. What was it like back then? The big points. The moon was closer to the earth. There were bacterial mats. It was warmer and more humid and that kind of things. The highlights of what it was like back then. And then we have a now. Why should you visit Barberton today? Take the whole family, even those that aren't necessarily interested in geology. So you could go mountain biking, paragliding. It's the gateway to the Kruger Park and that type of thing. So it's just meant to be one graphic that'll attract people to visit Barberton and especially to go on that geo trail. So that is the broad idea of this design. And I'm going to circulate this as well to anybody who's interested for your input. All right. Then we've got the multi-time sites, and these are all the museums, Albany Museum, and we've got the Council of Geoscience Museum, Ditsong, the Geological Museum at Museum Africa, Iziko Museum. And there you can see all the list of museums that we were thinking of kind of adding. Also, to get people to go and look at the geoheritage exhibitions in those museums. All right, and then don't forget, we are going to have an online version of this exhibit with downloadable posters and any other information or posters other people have created, which they don't mind sharing with the public and they would like people to download, teachers, etc., to have access to. And that's it. Funding, obviously, from the REI Fund. We're also getting some top-up funding from the COE in Paleosciences and the DSI SASTA, So we do have funding, and that will really help us, especially to look at that online version of the project, which when we put this together was going to be a small component. But after the virus, we realized we're going to have to expand considerably. And now we've got our technical advisory panel, and these are some of the people that have very kindly agreed to help with providing technical advice. But especially, we appreciate the help from each site that we're going to create a poster for on what should they think are the highlights of their site and of their area, what should be there, and also provide us with photographs and that type of things. I design an artwork. I mentioned Maggie Newman, and that poster and the posters and the actual design work are Francois and Debbie Smith of Cuba Productions. And hopefully next year we'll be able to go to SciFest Africa, Rand Show, Yebohoho. We want to get into Maropeng, and we sort of started talking to them before COVID, maybe Comic-Con and Rage again. We'd love to go down to Cape Town, and of course, we're going to definitely continue to develop that online presence. And that's the project. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ian. That was amazing. So thank you very much. So there's quite a lot in this important aspect that is geoheritage that we can, discuss, and Craig can maybe add a bit later on after the questions, just about what we're planning as well, and in terms of an event, and because there's a lot that we need to discuss and have some sort of event. But I'll just start off on a lighthearted note because there's quite a few questions on the chat there. Putela had a few, starting with, okay, that map would be nice on a Juve cover. So yeah, perhaps Maggie Newman can assist with that. He can have some bedrock and pillow lavas to sleep with as well. But one of the questions, on a serious note, the comments he had was around what is this? So could crystals be a viable source of piezoelectricity? So, because there's a lot of talk about renewable energy, so I'm throwing it to the floor as suggested by Leslie, and then I'll get to the other questions. Any ideas about that? Anyone, please unmute yourself if you've got any commentary to that. Okay. All right, if you do have any ideas, look, we'll still, there'll still be time even during the breaks as well to have discussions around these if we don't get to all of the questions now, but it would be interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking that there's so many related topics in geology and in geosciences, and I mean, that you could easily do a small exhibition on and travel around, maybe as part of a bigger one. And it might be geological minerals and renewable energy, for example. That would be a wonderful exhibit to have, which I think relates to the crystals and the piezoelectricity. Another one would maybe be minerals that are used in building, and there's just so much. I mean, we kind of scraping, just doing it, covering a tiny bit of the use of minerals and geological knowledge and how it applies to the world.
And on the topic of displays, a second comment from Putela, and I think it was Leslie as well. I mean, you sort of showcase some of the places where there are these displays. I mean, I know one, the Geology Museum in Newtown that you mentioned there. And I think you mentioned some of the struggles, Ian, if there's no government support. And maybe, Craig, would you like to expand on that, or we'll leave that for later on?
I can make a couple of comments about it. First of all, just for everybody's information, I mean, there are lots of things going on in South Africa by lots of different groups, and it tends to be happening in isolation. And one of the things that is going on is that there's some efforts which Richard and Morrisville Union are involved in with a fellow named Alan Wiggle to try and get some sort of overarching view. It would be a great thing to have a source of information for geotourists or geotourism available in one place, and that's kind of what we're working for, but there are lots of things going on. Now, having said that, there was a meeting with the Department of Tourism about a week ago, and to make a long story short, in terms of funding, the Department of Tourism is very limited as to the kinds of organizations they can partner with. We hear all these noises about public-private sector partnerships to make things happen in all aspects of our lives, but in reality, it's a little more difficult. Now, Ian's vehicle may be a way to do this. And I'm going to be forwarding this presentation to several people who are not on this conference at the moment. But there are lots of things happening. We need to put it all together, and this is an important component of it, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, I'll just go through a few of the questions here from Xavier. The first one, would it be possible to do a maze version? So a mobile and even interactive, and such that it can be taken to previously disadvantaged communities. A bit like the old mobile library initiatives. Ian?
Yes, and ours is mobile. And with some more funds, we could even make it more mobile. So when we take it down to Makonda, for example, it takes us a day to set up that maze, maybe a day and a half. We have to unload it. We build the maze. We just use the press boards that they've got that are available. And we do definitely make it as interactive as we can within principle. So yes, we could definitely go to interactive communities, but then you've got to kind of either have a very expensive one that you could sort of have a pop-up one out of a box with the back of the van, or you just take our one and you just select components that you decide to take there. I was thinking, how about an erupting volcano for something interactive? You press a button and the volcano erupts. It's just such fun to sit and think about interactive ideas that will amaze kids. A geyser like Yellowstone or anything. There's just so many ideas. A microscope with minerals. There's just so many ideas. And so we have done some of that, and we're just hoping to refine the exhibition and make it even more portable. And yes, travel as far as we can.
Thank you, and good morning. So my study is mainly about obtaining lutetium hafnium isotope data and more age data for the fieldwood subsuite. So I just want to thank again the REI Fund for the money. I really appreciate that. This is part of the study area. The study area is located in the far northwest of South Africa, in the Northern Cape. It's on the Orange River, and it's part of the Namakwa-Natal Mobile Belt, which is a Proterozoic mobile belt, which is thought to be associated with the assembly of the Rodinia supercontinent. And it crops out in Natal and in the Northern Cape, and the western part of it in the Northern Cape is called the Namakwa Metamorphic Province. So the study area is part of that. And this is just a picture showing part of the study areas. So you can see it's a lot of outcrop, arid conditions, and mountainous type of country. So the fieldwood subsuite, which is the focus of the study, is it's the oldest and the most mafic member of the Fjordsdrift suite, which is the plutonic unit of the Richtersveld magmatic arc. Together with the Orange River group, which is the extrusive, the volcano sedimentary unit. So those, the Periosteometric suite and the Orange River group together, they form the Richtersveld magmatic arc. And the Richtersveld magmatic arc has typical calc-alkaline geochemical trends. So all previous studies suggest that it was formed in a continental subduction zone tectonic setting, like the modern Andean arc, where you have ocean crust subducting beneath a thick continental crust. So the Periosteometric subsuite, like I said, that's the oldest and the most mafic unit of the plutonic suite, and it occurs as these isolated bodies, mafic, ultramafic bodies within the younger granites, intruded by the younger granites, granitoids. And in a subduction model, as suggested by previous studies, the Periosteometric subsuite would represent remnants of the mantle-derived fluids, the early mantle-derived melts. So the aims of the study, there is quite a substantial amount of geochemical data already available for the Periosteometric subsuite. The Periosteometric subsuite is easily recognizable. These dark weathering bodies. There are also other mafic rock types around, so but these dark weathering bodies can easily be recognized within the surrounding granites. And like I said, quite a substantial amount of geochemical data is available from previous studies. Some of these bodies have been mapped in more detail and been named by Professor Dave Reed and his students at UCT, but there is still no lutetium hafnium isotope data available, and the lutetium hafnium isotope data in general is scarce for Paleoproterozoic mafic, ultramafic rocks worldwide. So that's the first aim of the study, is to provide new lutetium hafnium isotope data, and then also to provide new uranium lead age data from zircon and apatite, because there's only a few, to my knowledge, there are only 2 zircon dates available for the Periosteometric subsuite, and I'm not aware of any age data from apatite, and that will be analyzed by laser ablation ICP-MS. That's the first aim. The second aim is to test the possible correlation of similar bodies in the southeast Richtersveld. The Richtersveld magmatic arc rocks in the eastern area, southeast of Joelsdrift. Currently, all the mafic, ultramafic bodies in that area is included in the Periosteometric subsuite, but it is separated from the west. The southeast Richtersveld is west of this so-called named Nababe Plateau, which is Phanerozoic, late Proterozoic Nama group sediments overlying the basement rock there. So the Richtersveld magmatic arc rocks to the east of it reappear to the west of it in the southeast Richtersveld. But these to the west, there are some very pronounced differences in the rocks between the east and west of that plateau. And the mafic, ultramafic bodies in the southeast Richtersveld are currently not included in the Periosteometric subsuite. So that's another aim of the study, is especially to provide age data for these bodies. That would be the most important piece of evidence to show whether it should be included in the Periosteometric subsuite or not. And then thirdly is just to contribute to Paleoproterozoic crustal evolution models. The research approach is, I'm hoping new techniques would provide new insights in available models and theories. And then there are these 2 publications, articles, which have had a huge influence. Hamilton and Armstrong. Now, the popular theory for crustal growth, the growth of the Earth's crust, is that it grew from very little in the Archean, and through time it became bigger and bigger through extraction from the mantle, and in the process the mantle became continuously depleted, and the crust grew basically to what it is today. That's the popular theory. But what these two, Armstrong and Hamilton, are saying is that no, the Earth differentiated into a core, mantle, and crust, like it is today, basically, already very early in the Archean, and that so the crust did not grow, but through time it just underwent continuous recycling through internal magmatic processes. And I'm personally a very big fan of that idea, so I'm looking for evidence for that, basically in everything I do. But if you take available neodymium isotope and you plot the Richtersveld magmatic arc on the evolutionary model of the evolution of a neodymium isotope as it theoretically would be since the start of the Proterozoic, then clearly the Richtersveld magmatic arc and the fieldwood subsuite did not originate directly from a depleted mantle. Now, it might have originated directly from a bulk earth mantle, as suggested in some previous studies. It might also be the product of mixing between depleted mantle and crustal materials. So it does not differentiate between the two models, but it does show that at least it did not come directly from a depleted mantle, as the popular theory strictly would assume. So my methodology was, I just went to the field and collected samples. I made 10 sections. The same results are not finished, but I have Xrf results. These were done at our department at Free State University. So our ICP-MS analysis for rare earth elements will be done at University of Johannesburg. And then, of course, the laser ablation analysis for age and isotope data will also be done at University of Johannesburg. Those have not been done yet. And then just simple data processing, reporting, and hopefully publishing. So what I've done, where I went to the field, is it just to show typical occurrences. The mafic, ultramafic bodies, they weather positive in relation to the surrounding granitoids. So they always form these prominent dark weathering yields, nice contact relationships. And they basically comprise mostly gabbro. And ultramafic rocks are peridotite and pyroxenite. And the gabbros weather typically to these rounded boulders, and they are the speckled appearance. And the ultramafic rocks, they weather to a red-brown color. You can also differentiate between them from a distance. The reddish weathering rocks will be the peridotites and pyroxenites. And the darker weathering rocks are the gabbros. Under the microscope, most of the rocks have been altered to serpentinite or amphibolite. So in the field, you will encounter mostly either serpentinite or amphibolite. The peridotites weather to serpentinite, and the gabbros weather to, they have been altered to amphibolites. But in places, you can still recognize the original minerals. So the original rocks can be recognized with olivine, pyroxene, and primary amphibole plagioclase in the gabbros. And peridotites, there are also pyroxenites with both clino and orthopyroxene. And the alteration processes from olivine to serpentine and from pyroxene to amphiboles And the amphiboles, they can be seen, these alteration processes can be seen in many samples. You can also recognize relic pyroxenes within the secondary amphiboles. So these features all indicate green schist facies metamorphism. I have obtained Xrf analysis, like I said, so I've just plotted them here on some selected diagrams. Two of them are tectonic discrimination diagrams. So what I've plotted here is the fieldwood subsuite samples from the Richtersveld bodies, just to see if they correlate geochemically. And then I've also plotted data for the Ganakurib dike suite. And if we look at the Google Earth image here, these dark lines, they are mafic dikes from the Ganakurib suite. It's in the same area, the Swartkop body and this dark body over here, they are fieldwood subsuite body. So why I've plotted the dikes is to compare them, because we know the dikes are mantle-derived material. They come from the mantle. And the fieldwood subsuite, it's suggested to come from the mantle too. So I've just plotted the dikes to compare them. So from these diagrams, there are basically three things that we can say. First of all, the fieldwood subsuite and the Richtersveld body seem to correlate. They are indistinguishable from each other on all the diagrams. Secondly, the fieldwood is very distinct from the dikes. The dikes plot typically as you would expect for mantle material, but the fieldwood subsuite is very distinct from that on all the diagrams, and more other diagrams too. These were selected nickel and chromium and magnesium. They are very compatible in the mantle. So they will concentrate in the mantle and not in the melts extracted from the mantle. And then the third thing to note is that the fieldwood subsuite on the tectonic discrimination diagrams is not distinctly calc-alkaline. They do not plot distinctly in the calc-alkaline field, which suggests that it might not be, the fieldwood subsuite might not necessarily be related to a continental subduction zone. Yeah, this is the isotope where I currently stand with the isotopes, and this is the most challenging part was the extraction of the zircon and apatite, because I did not have access to our laboratories last year for most of the year. So that limited the time I had. This is where I currently am. The samples was crushed and mold and sieve, and then the separation, first gravity and magnetic, heavy liquid separation, and then I handpicked under the microscope the zircons and the apatite grains, and this is where this currently stands. So these are embedded in double-sided tape at the moment. They must now be made into epoxy mount, polished, and then sent to Johannesburg for the analyses themselves, the laser ablation analysis. And this is just scanning electron microscope images of the zircons as they currently are embedded in the double-sided tape, just to see what their crystal shapes and sizes are. And well, the main thing is that they are relatively large, which means that there should be high enough concentrations of the isotopes in them to render good results, H results and isotope results. So yeah, that is basically where I currently am with my study.
All right, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. We've got time for questions. So if you would like to have any questions for Dr. Minnaar, please unmute yourself. If you are able to find your hand, please raise your hand using the raise hand feature. but you may unmute yourself and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. Just check if there's anything that has come up on the chat. Any questions for Hendrik? Please unmute yourself. Nolene, you unmuted yourself momentarily.
I was just going to say, Henrik seems to be let off the hook today.
Yeah.
That would be fine.
All right, last chance. Going once, going twice. Let me just have a look. There's Putela just asked, has this work, been published? And where can we find it, Hendrik?
No, it hasn't been published yet. I don't have all the data yet. So after the analysis has been done, I will work on the publication immediately after that.
All right, great stuff, and good luck with that. Raini?
You showed a slide with an age for the Namakwa of about 1,800, if I'm correct. One of the earlier slides, I think number 5. I think it was number 5.
Namakwa Natal belt, that one?
Yeah, that one, yes, yeah. It was an age of about 1,900 or so. Isn't that a bit old for the Namakwa belt? I thought it was much younger.
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have mentioned that. The Richtersveld magmatic arc is actually a remnant Paleoproterozoic crust within the Namakwa metamorphic province. So the Namakwa metamorphic province is between 1.2 and 1 billion years. But the Richtersveld magmatic arc is, like I say, it's a piece of remnant crust that's between 1,900 to 1,800 million years about. It's been overprinted by the Namakwa metamorphic province, but there is a piece of it, I should have said that actually here within the Fjolsdrift domain, and even outside that domain, you get zircon ages attesting to the older age of that. So that's a piece of Paleoproterozoic crust within the Namakwa metamorphic province.
Okay, thanks very much. I didn't realize that was a remnant of an older part of it.
Yes.
Thanks. I was more familiar with the 1,000 to 1,200 age.
Yeah.
Okay, George?
Thanks, Hendrik. Thanks, Sifiso. Hendrik, in the light of the current interest by the Council for Geoscience and the government in Northern Cape as a target for exploration, in the area that you're working in, are you aware of any exploration activities for the minerals that have been taking place or are taking place right now or in the past?
Yeah, I worked for the Council for Geoscience in Uppington many years. I've been at the university now for the past 3 years. But so yeah, there was, I think the past 5 years probably, there was a lot of exploration in the Copperton belt, basically between Copperton and Ariaga. That, as far as I know, that was the main exploration in recent years. But the Council for Geoscience has been doing a lot of mapping again, not exploration, of course, but mapping. I was also part of some of the mapping, also in southern Namibia. So yeah, it's very exciting studies. So I hope they would publish their results, or whatever way one can get a hold of the data. So I'm hoping for publication. But the other exploration, opening of Gamsberg was a big thing in recent years. But the other exploration activities, I'm not aware that really extended now.
Thank you.
Is that all outside the Richtersveld National Park, or is it parts of it inside the park?
That was mostly outside of the park, but I have an MSc student at the moment. We will be working inside the Richtersveld National Park. But yeah, the mapping, the Council for Geoscience mapping was also inside, but that covered a large area of which the Richtersveld, the national park, was part of. But I think at the moment there's not mapping that I know of going on in the park itself.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nolene. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As has been introduced, my name is Dandongwenya, and the topic I'll be discussing today is based on my MSc research under the supervision of Professor Sebastian Tappe. It will consist of a brief intro into lamprites before looking at the subsequent results that led us to our conclusions. Okay, before we get into it, I thought it was only appropriate that we thank the sponsors that funded the research, as shown in the slide here. The project would have not been possible without them, and so we thank them dearly. Okay, so as an introduction to lamprites, we first need to think about what lamprites actually are. And the most comprehensive explanation for this is that lamprites represent Mantle-derived ultrapotassic magmas, and the second most important primary deposit type for diamonds after Kimberlites. And looking at the schematic here, well, we can see that Kimballites are restricted to areas just beneath Archean shales. Lamprites would typically occur in the Proterozoic marble belts right next to them. A closer look into the lamprite in question here, we see that according to the eruption age of 220 million years suggested by Scott Smith et al. In 1989, the Kapamba lamprites would have erupted within the boundaries of the African LLSVP, as we can see here in the reconstruction of Gondwana 240 million years ago. Now, the Kapamba lamprite field extends 25 kilometers northwest along the Kapamba River, as you can see here, and it consists of 14 known pipes and associated dikes, which sits on the northwestern margin of the northeast trending Luangwa Rift Graben. A typical pipe at Kapamba would look something like this, with the magnetic material being surrounded by different types of lapilli-types. And the pipes at this lamprite field can extend up to 45 hectares in area, which in comparison is reasonably larger than the largest pipes in South Africa, which is the Cullinan pipe in Gauteng. Zooming out onto an African scale, we notice that the basin in question here, which is the Luangwa Rift Basin, forms part of the Karoo Age Basin found across South Central Africa. The Luangwa Rift Basin sits specifically, the Luangwa Rift Basin specifically sits on the eastern divergent margin of Gondwana, which was dominated by extensional regime during Gondwana breakup, which led to several rift basins forming in South Central Africa. The Luangwa Rift Valley itself sits within the Eremite belt, which is an intracrotonic fold and thrust belt, which was formed between 1.05 and 1 billion years ago. This intracrotonic fold and thrust belt consists of Paleoproterozoic basements, as you can see here, surrounded by supercrustal units intruded by granitoids. For previous studies, we can see that the only previous study focused on these Kapamba lamprites is one done by Scott Smith and dates back to the 1980s. And this actually makes sense when you take a look at the field conditions, which you would have to go through to acquire samples, as the Kapamba field sits within a game park, which is very much filled with live wildlife, as we can see here. But once the samples were acquired, we then came up with a list of project aims and objectives, which we wanted to complete for the study. And these included the mineralogy and petrology of the lamprites, in order for us to be able to compare them to other global lamproids and South African Group 2 Kimberlites. It also included the trace element analysis of magmatic olivines for the investigation of magmatic processes during crystallization. Now, to adjust everyone's eye to what a typical orangite or Group 2 Kimberlites would look like, what you can see here is the Postmasburg orangite, a picture taken from the Book of Mitchell in 1997. And we can see that the rock that we can see here basically consists of phenocryst of cyanopyroxene, phlogopite, and diopside, while the ground mass is dominated by diopside, phlogopite, and oxide. And this is basically implicating a metasomatically enriched SCLM source. A typical type 6 lamproid from Kapamba, however, would look something like this, with fresh olivine here, analytized lucite here, and diopside here, with the ground mass dominated by tetraferrophlogopite and diopside along with apatites, ilmenites, bienals, and laws. A type 10 lamproid would look something similar, but would have less fresh olivine, and instead of ilmenites would consist of perovskites, which allowed for radiometric dating. So a typical backscattered electron image of the lamproids from Kapamba would look something like this, and it is showing off the textures which are found within the Kapamba lamproids, which allowed us to classify them in terms of name. So we can see here that we have olivine xenocrysts, which can be resolved, and we also have microphenocrysts of olivine, which can be euhedral. We also see that we have analcine and diopside microphenocrysts, which can be sometimes showing off a chromatophoric texture. We also can see from this picture down here that the mica is mainly madupitic and basically includes most of the groundless phases around it. And because of all these reasons, the name that we came up for these lamproids is an olivine lucite diopside madupitic lamproids, or simply olivine lucite lamproids. Now, to look at the first set of results, we can look at the major element data. So looking at the major element data, we can see that these lamproids show compositions that classify them alongside other globally recognized Tectonic lamproids. We can see that in terms of their low aluminium content, as well as magnesium content, as well as their exceptionally high titanium content, they will classify as Tectonic lamproids. But when looking at their potassium content, we can see that initially they classify as shoshonitic, and then when we actually recalculate the potassium contents to remodel for the account of annelsinization, we can see that they actually replot as ultrapotassic as they actually should be. Again, looking at the whole rock composition of Kapamba lamproids, we can see that as they are virtually free of carbon dioxide, they contain quite a significant amount of calcium, as shown here, but both still classifying as Tectonic lamproids. But when looking at the potassium content again now in comparison to sodium, we can see that there is a need to recalculate for these contents again, which now moves these samples towards less sodium content and more potassium content, which is actually something that makes sense when you consider that the process of analcimization is the conversion of lucite into analcime through the substitution of potassium for sodium within the crystal structure at low temperatures. Now, to look at individual mineral chemistry. We can see that firstly, there are two olivine generations that exist at Kapamba. Firstly, we have metal xenocryst in the form of resolved peridotite-derived crystals with a phosphoritic content between 90 and 92 more %. We also see that there is the magnetic generation of olivines, which basically constitutes of microphenocrysts and overgrowth, and has a core phosphorytic content of between 90 to 86 moles percent and a rim phosphorytic content of below 86 moles percent. It should also be noted that the calcium content seen for the magmatic olivine microphenocrysts and overgrowth is exceptionally high and is actually atypical for magma types which do not contain any carbonates in them, just as these lamprites. For the clinopyroxene mineral group, we see that a majority of these clinopyroxenes are actually diopside rich, as can be seen over here. We also see that the data captured for Kapamba extend what is known from Mitchell for clinopyroxenes found in lamprites and orangites as they extend beyond this field that is shown here. Also evident here is the evolution of clinopyroxene minerals towards higher titanium content and relatively low aluminium content. And this is indicative of a strong aggregate components within these compositions. Looking at the Phlogopite composition, we see first down here a strong correlation between aluminium and titanium content, which is a trait that classifies these compositions together with other lamprite occurrences known globally, such as the Lucite Hill lamprites and the West Kimberlite lamprites, as well as some double craton orangites, as can be seen here. We can also see that the compositions for the phlogopites in terms of the aluminium iron evolution are different to what is suggested by Mitchell from his book of what is known for phlogopites compositions from orangites and lamprites. While we can see firstly here a negative correlation, which is increasing aluminium with decreasing iron content, which is indicative of tetraferrophlogopite component. We can also see a positive correlation of aluminium and iron, which is also similar to the evolution trend suggested for minutes, but not for lamprites. Moving on to olivine trace element data, which constitutes our next set of results. We start off with a variation diagram of titanium versus calcium, where we see that the olivine xenocryst from Kapamba, as can be seen here in blue, classify within this red box, which is suggested for typically low calcium and titanium contents of olivine in Mantle periodicites, which supports the claim of the origin of these melts. We can also see that these xenocrysts evolve towards a trend which is different from that suggested for olivines in periodicite xenoliths from the Kabul craton and olivine in lamprites and camouflagites from the West African and the East African provinces, respectively. When looking at the other diagram down here, we can see that according to their nickel contents versus the vanadium to scandium ratio, they classify relatively as oxidized in comparison to what is seen for olivine and periodicite xenoliths from the Kabul craton. When looking at the nature and origin of the olivine xenocryst based on the trace element systematics, we can see that according to the aluminium and vanadium variation diagram up here, that they are derived from garnet-bearing metal periodicites, although they seem to classify in between the two phases here. We can also see that when looking at the equilibration temperatures calculated based on the aluminium content in the olivine, we find that after projection of this equilibration temperature onto various cratonic geotherms, the ones most preferred for the Kabamba lamprites, which is between 40 and 42, implicate that the lithospheric astenospheric boundary below the Eomat belts at the time of the eruption of these lamprites at 220 million years ago was at depths of between 200 and 180 kilometers, which implicates a diamond stability field of between 90 and 15 kilometers. An investigation of the log oxygen fugacity versus the equilibration temperatures calculated for the Olivine spinel pairs found in these rocks shows that this equilibration temperature, firstly, which sits here, lies near the solidus curve for hydrated model periodicites, while also suggesting that the magma redox conditions below the akin to the phalite magnetite quartz buffer, which is similar to what is seen for melts produced by incipient lithospheric thinning at the North Atlantic Craton, but different for Kimberlite eruption at the Slave Craton. Oh, this also is evidence to suggest that the source for these melts is an enriched K-metasomatized perioditic mantle material and not reduced fluorine water-rich material. So, in conclusion, our petrology and geophysical surveys by Serafin et al. Allowed us to come up with a schematic model for the lithospheric architecture below the Tanzania Bengalu Craton and the Nisa Kalahari Craton, as well as the Eomat belt. And from this schematic, we can deduce that the periogenesis of this Kabamba lamprite as having started from the base of a 180 kilometer deep metasomatized mantle lithosphere and having migrated through the diamond stability field, which can be seen here, shown by this diamond. And it also went through a region of perioditic olivine, acquiring the phosphoritic content seen for the olivines before erupting into the Luangwa rift. This itself can serve as evidence for survival of Archean roots beneath reworked Proterozoic crust across sub-Saharan Africa. So all that has been presented here is just briefly the findings of a publication that is shown here in front of you. And if you would like to have a detailed explanation of anything that I have covered, then you are more than welcome to consult the publication. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ntando. Before we start any questions, Xavier turned up a little bit late, and if you could just go through the general age again of the lamprites for him, if you don't mind.
So I don't know if this will be explanatory enough, but from the age that was suggested by Scott Smith in the only previous study that we have of this lamprite is an eruption age of 220 million years ago, which was formulated from argon-argon dating from the phlogopites found within the lamprite.
Great, thanks so much. Are there any other questions? You can either raise your hand or just unmute yourself, jump in. Mark is asking if we can get a link for the paper.
I don't know if I can maybe try email to you, Nolin, maybe, and then have you distribute it to everyone. I don't know if that would be appropriate.
That's fine. Or you can just see if you can maybe put it in the chat.
Okay, yes, that's also possible.
Sorry, can I ask a question, Nolin?
Please go ahead.
No. I'm interested to ask you, what is the country rock in which is intruded? Is Karoo sediments and Karoo volcanics. Now these lamprites are 240 million years old. Can you tell me a little bit about the country rock in which it sits in the Karoo?
Yes, so as can be seen here, the longer, let me just, yeah, the longer route here, as shown, is part of, is actually underlain by Permo-Triassic and Permo-Triassic sediments. So the Kabamba lamprites actually sit on these Karoo age sediments, which are found within the basin itself.
Okay, so it can't. I guess it can't sit in the Triassic sediments, being of that age, but possibly lower Triassic, I guess.
Yes, I don't know if I can briefly just show something quickly. So something else that could be of interest to everyone is the actually ongoing perovskites radiometric age determinations, which would actually change the suggested age that we know for these lamprites. So what we have been dealing with is actually perovskite crystals of less than 25 microns in size, as you can see here with the perovskite crystal actually attached to granules here. And to actually be able to date these, we had to consider very extreme methods such as secondary iron mass spectrometry, as we can see that laser ablation would not work here. So after this was investigated in the Heidelberg iron probe in Germany, what was found from this is that after analyzing 10 grains of perovskites, we see that a majority of them actually fall within the same range of a mean age. And the suggested age is actually 130 million years ago.
Okay.
And while this would change this bar, so actually somewhere over here, we see that this also is still relevant because at this point here, which would be about 130 million years ago, it still corresponds to a high African plate velocity and a pretty significant number of African Kimberlite eruptions.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's still a work in progress, I guess.
Yes, yes, very much so.
Excellent. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions, comments? Right. It seems that you're off the hook. And Ntando, thank you so much for your talk. It was very enlightening.
Hello, everybody. Yeah. I'm Charles here, presenting part of my MSc project, the mineral characterization of platinum group elements in the UG2 at the Buffelshoek Farm, Eastern Bushveld Complex. So basically, I will take you through the background of the study and then the methods that we used and go through results and then discuss and conclude the results. So the Buffelshoek Farm is a new acquisition of Two Rivers Platinum Mine. The Two Rivers Platinum Mine is located in the eastern limb of the Bushveld complex. Just to give a little bit of background, the platinum group elements in the Bushveld are sitting or are hosted in the Platte Reef, the Marinsky Reef, and the UG2. So at the Two Rivers Platinum Mine, the reefs that are there is the UG2 reef and the Marinsky Reef. So the Buffelshoek is southeast of Cross River, which is the main farm for the Two Rivers Platinum Mine. And in this presentation, I will be looking at two boreholes that were drilled there, and in particular, the deflections of these boreholes. At the Two Rivers Platinum Mine, or at the
buffers who form the new acquisition in particular. What is interesting is that the reef is a bit different compared to the current mine site at Dwarfs River, where the UG2 is about 1.2 to 1.4 meter thick. Here, the reef is a bit thin and the grades are a bit higher. So the prospect is interesting because the stratigraphic features are a bit different compared to the mining site. So at the Buffelshoek farm, or generally around the Two Rivers Platinum Mine, the UG2 can be characterized into three fishes: the normal reef, the split reef, and the multiple split reef. So the split reef will have a pyroxenite parting or a thin layer of pyroxenite within the chromatite, typically about 10 centimeters, and then the multiple split reef will vary with different parting or different layers of pyroxenite within the layers. So the boreholes that we looked at, the borehole that I'm presenting here is the normal reef and the multiple split reef. So just a bit of background, the PGEs in the UG2 are sitting in the PG minerals or the platinum group minerals, and these elements are recovered as PGMs using flotation method at the mine. So during flotation, some of these elements are lost to flotation tailings. So typically this is attributed to the mineralogical complexities of the platinum group minerals. So part of the study is to look at the PGM phases, abundance, association, and grain size distribution that can be attributed to such losses. So like I said, the grades are a bit high. So we want to understand where these PGEs are sitting in the PGMs. So the aim of the study was to investigate the mineralogical characteristics of this platinum group element in the UG2 at the Buffelshoek farm, and to understand the mineralogical implication of these PGMs to recovery, and to understand how these PGMs control the PGEs. So what we've done was to log core. The mine had already sampled the core, half core, and the assay, and provided assay results to us. And then we sampled quarter core and prepared polished blocks. And most of our work was analysis of the polished blocks. So we did a ore petrographic study, and then we looked at Mla analysis of these polished blocks to provide the PGM phases, abundance, association, and grain size distributions. And we also looked at microprobe to analyze the mineral chemistries of these PGMs, but the work is not presented here. So the UG2 at Buffelshoek is mostly characterized by disseminated chromite, and it shows uneven textures. And due to recrystallization, as these disseminated chromite recrystallize, they grow, and then the larger chromite grains that they recrystallize to typically cluster in this area. So the other thing to observe under a backstated image on the right, it's disseminated base metal sulfide across the UG2 in this area. So the other characteristics that we observed at Buffelshoek farm is deformation characteristics of the UG2, where we had fractures or pull-apart textures, and the base metal sulfide shows a post-deformation mineralization that fills the cracks of this deformation. And we've seen that some of this chromite shows low baked texture. And we looked at the individual minerals under a petrographic microscope, and then mostly we identified pentlandite and chalcopyrite. So we also looked at individual Pgms under a microprobe, but we are not presenting the microprobe work. Here I'm just showing Kimballites, which is interesting, and I'll discuss that in the next few slides. So the essay that was provided by the mine shows a typical bottom-loaded UG2. So on the left, the sample numbers are put in a stratigraphic column from leader seams to the bottom of the reef at the bottom. So we used this grade distribution to sample the higher grade horizons, and we send the samples for Mla analysis. So from the Mla data, this is the overall mineralogical composition of the normal reef and the multiple split reef that we looked at, and it's a typical UG2 chromatite. The multiple split reef chromatite has abundance of silicate that is expected because of the patterns that we see within the UG2 multiple split reef. And in the next slide, I will show the sulfides. In this slide, the sulfides, due to the proportion, are not visible in proportion. So here I'm just displaying the various sulfides, but with the same mineral composition. So typically in the UG2, you'll have less than 0.1 sulfide. So the Mla confirms that. We can see on this distribution. And we looked at the various mineral phases, and looking at the grain count, we grouped the various mineral phases into PGE sulfides, PGE alloys, PGE antimonites, PGE tellurites, PGE bismutellurite, and PGE arsenite. And this shows that the PGE sulfides and the PGE arsenites are dominant in this area. Looking at the distribution of the PGE and the PGM, or how the PGM can influence the PGE down the stratigraphy, we looked at PGE distribution, and here we can see that platinum is mostly dominant in the normal reef, and the PGM that is mostly dominant is the PGE sulfide, followed by the PGE arsenite. In the multiple split reef, the palladium increased a bit, but platinum is still higher than the palladium. And then the arsenite also increased in composition compared to the normal reef. However, the PGE sulfides are still dominant. So based on the PGE sulfides that are dominant, we look at the individual sulfide, and here we show the various sulfides that we observed. So in literature, copperite and bragite are typical in the UG2 to be dominant. However, a new mineral Kimballites that we have not seen in the literature also here is a bit dominant. So that's why I showed a backscattered image of Kimballites in the previous slide. So the
using MLA as well, we looked at where the palladium platinum group elements are sitting, and palladium is mostly in sulfides and alloys, whereas platinum is mostly in sulfides and arsenides, whereas rhodium is almost entirely in sulfides. So we also looked at the Pgm Mineral Association. So the Pgm are mostly associated with base metal sulfides, chromite, and silicate. In the base metal sulfide, they're mostly associated with pentlandite, and then with the silicate, they're mostly associated with amphibole. We looked at the grain size distribution. So typically, the grain sizes are between 2 micron and 19 micron. So in conclusion, our UG2 at the Buffalo Hook is typically bottom loaded, and the platinum abundance is generally higher than the palladium abundance. So looking at the PGM phases, the sulfides are mostly dominant, followed by arsenides, alloys, antimonites, tellurides, and least the bismuth telluride. And these PGMs are mostly associated with base metal sulfide, chromite, and silicate. And they are typically between 2 micron and 19 micron, with platinum occurring mostly as platinum sulfide, platinum arsenide, and then palladium as palladium sulfide and palladium alloys, whereas rhodium as typically occurs as rhodium sulfide. So with this information, we can look at the flotation recovery of the various PGMs, and part of the additional work is to now try to determine how this will affect the recovery, and also look at how we can relate the chemistry of these PGMs with the much more convenient and cheaper assay results, so that when the mine look at their assay results, they can have some sort of chemistry proxies to say, maybe, for example, platinum, when platinum is dominant, we are more likely to get platinum sulfide or something like that. And I think that it's the end of my presentation. I would like to thank GSSA, University of Limpopo, and Northwest University for funding the project, the Two Rivers Platinum Mine for allowing access to this data sampling and research, the University of Johannesburg for allowing and supporting the Mla analysis and microprobe analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really excellent talk. Are there any questions for Charles? You can just unmute yourself and ask the question if you'd like. No questions? Right, Charles, thanks very much for that. If you could stop sharing your screen, please.
Thank you, Nolene.
Thank you so much. Oh, there's a question for you. Did you probe the base metals for PGE?
Can you please repeat the question?
Did you probe the base metals for PGE?
Yeah, but the first few was just to try and understand the different shades of PGEs compared to sulfides. So I did a few just to look at the different contrasts so that I can identify the PGEs.
Thank you very much for today's colloquium and inviting me to talk. So I will be talking today about kimberlites and sort of give a little bit of an overview, how they form and what sort of our current understanding is where these magmas come from. I've just chosen this image here, down here. That's from the type locality in Kimberley, which was discovered more than 150 years ago, or 150 years ago. And 150 years later, we probably still have no real answer what's actually going on, even though we have new fancy data and so on. So there's still a lot of mystery around this rock. So just before I get started, just some acknowledgements for project partners and also sort of supporters who have helped us in the last 10 years. And on the top panel, you just see some project partners, and the bottom panel just lists some in-kind and also financial funding. And today, obviously, I would like to acknowledge the GSSA, especially the REI Fund, who has been helping my students for the last 5-6 years on a regular basis. So kimberlites, where do they occur? Where do they come from? So if we just plot the occurrences of kimberlites on the world map, you can pretty much see that every continent has kimberlites. You see North America, Greenland, Siberia, Australia, and of course, Africa. And it's pretty much also depicting very well where the cratons sit, or the thick continental shields. So there seems to be a very strong connection between kimberlite magmatism and where we actually have old Archean or Proterozoic lithosphere. Maggie Newman was mentioned already a couple of times today. This is sort of her view from 20 years ago, sort of how kimberlites fit to something like sort of a cratonic root. And obviously, as an artist and an artist's impression, it has to look fancy and extreme. And that's also good for geotourism and all these things. But in reality, I hate to say it, but kimberlites are probably a very unspectacular process in the end of the day if we look at it from a scientific point of view. So I hope I will sort of convey that message during my talk. This is, gives me great pleasure to actually speak a few minutes, maybe a few seconds, about this work. This goes back to Craig Smith, who has been for a very long time now with the GSSA. And this is a landmark paper from now close to 40 years ago, from 1983 in Nature, where he was the first one to actually measure the isotopic compositions of South African kimberlites here in this red envelope. This is a simple neodymium isotopic against strontium isotopic plot. And Craig was the first one sort of to systematically show that we actually in Africa have two types, the group 1s, which I will be talking today about, and then also the group 2s. So let's just ignore those for a moment, or for today maybe. So the main finding that Craig sort of for the first time sort of described was that there is this offset from what we call bulk earth here, this crosshair, that we have the systematic offset to more depleted isotopic compositions in kimberlites. And the easiest explanation for this by the time was that they actually must come from an upper mantle source. So my conclusion will be pretty much the same 40 years later by using very different tools. So Craig got this already right 40 years ago. But you will see that there's a lot of push for pushing kimberlites into the lower mantle. And sort of my job today is to show you that lower mantle origins for kimberlites are probably quite unlikely. The other observation that was also made in that paper by Craig was the strong overlap with these OIBs, ocean island basalts. So it's sort of these fancy islands that sit in the oceans, very often sort of tourist destinations. And it's kind of obvious that people would want those things to come from plumes. And if kimberlites have very similar isotopic compositions, the kimberlites must also come from very deep plumes, according to some studies. So 40 years later, we have way more isotopic data for kimberlites, not just from Africa, also from all over the world, all the cratons that I showed earlier in blue here. And we also have new isotope systems, like in this case, I show you just the hafnium isotopic compositions of kimberlites, and neodymium you have already seen. And the story hasn't changed one bit from what Smith already had 40 years ago. Kimberlites sort of move around the bulk earth value, which is this crosshair. They can be a little bit more depleted, also a little bit more enriched, but they don't really move very far away from this, which calls for fairly regular mantle sources as sort of the simplest explanation for this. And again, if we look at hafnium neodymium isotope space, we can again see the strong overlap with these ocean island basalts here in these gray circles. So that also hasn't changed. So what that means, if the ocean islands are explained by deep mantle plumes coming somewhere from the lower mantle, from the core mantle boundary, and they have very similar isotopic compositions to Kimballites, that's essentially the root for why there is the strong movement of also wanting the Kimballites to come from the core mantle boundary. So if there would be a continent here, and of course there's no Kimberlite drawn in here, but that is sort of where the scientific literature is heading, to sort of always go for the most extreme explanation. So I will be using the terms upper mantle and lower mantle quite a bit during my talk. And just sort of to set the scene for this, the upper mantle is usually what is obviously below the crust, but goes to about 660, 670 kilometers. Sort of it's this part. And from there on all the way to the core mantle boundary at around 3,000 kilometer depths, that's the lower mantle. And sort of now, do Kimballites really come from the lower mantle, or do they just form in the upper mantle just below our continents? So that's one of the key questions here. So to do that, I sort of do a mini review of the evidence that we have for lower mantle origins for Kimballites. So for that, we can look quickly at ultra deep diamonds, and then we can look at these plume generation zones, or they also commonly referred to as sort of shear velocity provinces in the lower mantle. And in this case, we actually sit on top of one, on top of the African LLSVP. So that's sort of the evidence we may have for lower mantle origins. Then I will talk about my favorite model. It's the upper mantle origin for Kimballites. And for that, I will show you some tungsten 182 isotope data. So that's isotopic data for Kimballites from Africa that should, in theory, sort of debunk the lower mantle origin for Kimballites. And then I sum this up by actually making a quick statement how you actually make these carbon dioxide-rich magmas in the upper mantle. And that leads me to my preferred model then. So part one, lower mantle Kimballites. So it's just a bunch of diamonds. They're actually quite spectacular in this case, but those would be typical lithospheric diamonds, okay? They sit sort of in the bottom part of the cratonic lithosphere, shallower than 250 kilometer depths. We know that from inclusion studies, sort of, that they're sort of tied to the cratonic lithosphere. And that's sort of more than 95% of typical production would essentially draw diamonds from the lithosphere. But then we have those guys, those sublithospheric diamonds that come from below the lithosphere. And in this case, we can sort of, based also on inclusion work and on sort of also theoretical considerations, we can say that they come from somewhere 250 kilometers to 800 kilometers. That's sort of the greatest steps that's sort of being reported. And if you remember the number that I mentioned earlier, 660 kilometers. So here we are touching into the uppermost lower mantle. So by inference, one would assume if a Kimberlite brings stuff like this up, then the Kimballites must also come from the lower mantle. And later on, I will explain why this doesn't have to be like that. The important feature here is that you don't see these euhedral crystal phases anymore. All of the stuff is heavily resorbed. So it has gone through a long history, probably also by movement in convecting mantle and maybe even in some form of plume mantle during early Earth processes. The one important thing here is that these dark specks, you can also see some here and here. This was earlier thought to be graphite, but more recent work has actually shown that these dark inclusions are very often metal inclusions in these super deep diamonds. So this is just an image taken from the work by Evan Smith from a few years back, and showing that there is a lot of sulfides involved, there's metal alloys involved, also carbides. So this is really heavily reduced metal material that also fits quite well with a sort of a lowermost upper mantle to top lower mantle origin for these diamonds, ultimately, when they formed. So that's where, in this case, those images were taken from Andy Moore's paper from 2014. And just where they come from, those are, in this case, from Letseng mine. And I just would want to say one word about spurious correlations. Probably it's kind of common knowledge probably that Letseng mine is one of the lowest grade operating diamond mines. The diamond grade is extremely low, and the money is being made essentially from these super deep diamonds that are extremely valuable. And it's also the highest elevation diamond mine in the world. So lowest grade and highest elevation. That's a classical spurious correlation. And I will need this word in a few moments, when essentially things seem to correlate, but there's absolutely nothing to this. So that's called a spurious correlation for the students, in case you have not heard that word before. So ultra deep diamonds. So in this diagram, which is rather complicated, and I walk you through this, my message will be that they are actually rather shallow, and that we should not forget. They get this attribute of being ultra deep or super deep. But if we just look at this, here we at surface, and here we go all the way to the 3,000 kilometers to the core mantle boundary. Yeah? The question mark is where most of the lower mantle sits, and that's sort of the upper mantle here, right? So if we just look at our regular cratonic diamonds, that's the gray bar here, and that's the diamonds, that's the carbon isotope composition of these diamonds. So we see from the typical mantle value at -5 delta carbon 13 here, where 95% of the diamonds have that value, we see that they can go all the way to -40, which clearly involves some subducted components if you go to such a light carbon isotopic composition. So that's where they form, just quite close to surface, actually, in the bigger scheme of things. Then we have our ultra deep diamonds. Those are the colors here. And those are the different inclusions that can be found in them. Majoritic garnet, magnesium perovskite, which is now called bridgemanite, and then calcium perovskite phases. So I mentioned 800 kilometers. That's the deepest depth we get, just top of the lower mantle. And that's the carbon isotopic composition. So from a few that have mantle-like isotopic values, you see that the vast majority also gets very light carbon isotopic composition, which means this is subducted material in most cases. And it seems just from these data alone that we really deal with a cycle that happens just from crust to the bottom of the upper mantle, and hardly ever we really touch into the lower mantle. And there's a lot of things we actually don't know what's going on. So the one observation that has been made over the last 10 years is that global Kimballites tend to cluster around these geophysical features here. And I just show you the one for Africa. That's the African LLSVP. It's a low shear velocity province. And I will explain in a moment what that really is. And those are Kimballites, actually, not just African, worldwide. And 85% of these Kimballites really tend to stick towards the edges or even to the interior of these deep-seated geophysical features. So that's an observation that's now 10 years old, and it's being repeated, but it's a pure observation. It has been challenged a lot that these correlations can be actually spurious, that there's actually no real genetic connection to this. And I would be subscribing to this and show you some data why I think those are spurious correlations. So what are these LLSVPs? So it stands for Large Low Shear Velocity Province. And they sit, there's the African one here, and there's one beneath the Pacific antipodal. And they sit just on top of the core. So in this diagram, everything has been stripped off, crust and mantle, and we just look at the top of the core, which is the red here. Then we have in blue, that's subducting oceanic lithosphere that's going down all the way into the lower mantle in this model. And then we have this African LLSVP wrapped around the core, and the Pacific one here. That's just another way of showing this, that the LLSVP is riding piggyback on top of the core. CMB stands for core mantle boundary. So that's supposed to be in quite a few Kimbalite models now, supposed to be the source region for global Kimballites, these LLSVPs. And that's what that could look like just in this cartoon. You have these LLSVPs, they're plume generation zones. There's one beneath the Pacific, gives you a lot of these ocean island basalts in the Pacific Ocean. And then there's one beneath the African continent, and it gives you essentially Kimballites, other small scale volcanoes. And then in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, some of the ocean islands that sit there. And just to reiterate, just if we look at the 90 million year Kimballites in Southern Africa and also in Brazil, they sit within the realm of this LLSVP, which is supposed to be the plume generation zone, the edge of this area here from where plume material can start to rise. So the question is if, as geochemists, we're sometimes limited with our tools, what we can actually do to prove or test something. And the one question that should be asked is if we can see anything in kimberlites that comes from the Earth core, or at least from these primordial components that are part of these LLSBPs. So those would be quite extreme components. This is sort of very metal-rich stuff, and this is sort of ancient silicate material. And all of these should have very distinctive isotopic compositions. And if one can find this, that would be sort of a good evidence for this lower mantle or super deep origin of kimberlites. So now I sort of move on with presenting some evidence and sort of will end up that the evidence actually speaks for upper mantle origins of kimberlites, not so much for lower mantle origins. So we carry on with the LLSBPs. And I mentioned just a moment ago that geochemists very often are limited in their tools. But since a couple of years, we have a new tool, and that's the decay system of hafnium to this element tungsten. And that's what I will be talking about for a couple of minutes now. So this is meant to be a cross-section to the Earth using this avocado. And I like this because it sort of has the proportions quite right. If you do dark green here, that can be our crust. That can be the lithospheric mantle, this green. Then we go slowly into the convecting upper mantle, lower mantle, and then the core. Even that proportion is quite right. The core is quite big. So the important thing with those two elements is that one, the hafnium is a lithophile element, which means it really likes silicates, and that means it likes rocks. And tungsten is a siderophile element, which means it likes iron, and that means it likes metal. We all know that the Earth core is made to a significant portion of metal, and the mantle and crust are mainly silicate rocks. So that means during early Earth processes, when sort of the Earth differentiated, all the tungsten is being drawn into the Earth core, and all the hafnium is left behind sort of in the mantle and crust. So we are effectively stripping these two elements apart, especially near the core mantle boundary in this region. That's where the separation is very strong. And I'm just use this image here, the stamp of Victor Moritz Goldschmidt, who's probably the most famous geochemist the planet has ever seen. And it's just for my students as a reminder that today is the Goldschmidt Conference abstract deadline, and also a reminder to anybody else that the terms lithophile, siderophile, atmophile go back to Goldschmidt, who was also the first to determine the siderophile character of tungsten, just on a side note. So how can we use this decay of hafnium to tungsten? So this is sort of just a primer on this. It's the mass 182 hafnium that decays to tungsten 182. And the important thing is that that happens very quickly. And the half-life of that decay is only 9 million years. And if you just look at this ratio, 182 hafnium, 180, you can see that after 60 million years in this exponential decay curve, there's essentially no 182 left, which is the parent here. And after 60 million years, that decay system is dead. It's extinct. It doesn't exist anymore. If I say it in different words, is 60 million years into solar system history, this ratio here, 182, which is the daughter over another stable isotope, is essentially a constant ratio. That would be a stable isotope ratio sort of throughout most of Earth history. It only is a radiogenic isotope system the first 60 million years. And that's exactly the time when the core separated from the mantle, which means during that time we can produce extreme isotopic differences that are intrinsic to the Earth core and also to the lowermost mantle, but we would not have them somewhere in the crust or in the upper mantle. So that's important because this isotope system can now be used to trace really stuff that comes from near the core mantle boundary. Going forward, I will be using, instead of ratios, I will be using the same what we do with carbon isotopes and neodymium isotopes. We use notations. I will just be talking about this mu182 tungsten value, which is essentially just a conversion of that ratio. And we will, or I will, you can see this here in this publication, there's the mu182 tungsten, and most rocks, crustal rocks, upper mantle rocks have a value of 0 because it's a stable isotope ratio, as I mentioned, for most of Earth history. And then we can get extreme values, extremely positive or extremely negative, if you really tap very strange reservoirs. And this is a model by Jones from just 2 years back. And they modeled that if any sort of magma entrains material from the core, like less than 1%, we draw this composition, the tungsten isotopic composition of that magma, very quickly to very negative values. And we can play the same game with positive values coming from some sort of silicate component that is ancient, that is sort of primordial. It just needs a little bit more, but still after 10% addition of this, we would see isotopic differences. And this exercise has been done. You can see how new this research direction is. This is just a paper from last year from a group in Vienna. And you can see that this group has measured pretty much all the ocean island basalts that have sort of a big name. Sort of that's the list here, Hawaii, Azores, and other holiday destinations here. So they measured all these islands, basalts from these islands, and you can see that they get, for most of them, very negative values. Sort of this goes all the way down to -20. So, and this has been interpreted really as that there is a core component in these ocean islands, and that the plume model works, that this is really plume source and the plume straw material from near the core mantle boundary. Just the gray bar here, the gray envelope here around the 0 value, that's essentially the analytical uncertainty. This is measuring a standard over and over again, and we can reproduce standards within that gray band. So if a sample falls like here, then we essentially have no anomaly because it's within resolution of 0 and our reproducibility of the standard. And if they really fall outside, we really have a strong anomaly. So just to sort of give you a little cartoon on what we think, how this should look like. So we have the Earth core. The Earth core would have a mu-182 tungsten value of -220, yeah, because of its history. And the upper mantle here is essentially 0 with an uncertainty of ±5. That was the gray band that I just explained. And if material rises here, like in red, you sort of pollute the lower mantle with those negative values, and this will never reach the upper mantle, sort of because it gets diluted away. So if we can trace tungsten anomalies, we know it comes from the core mantle boundary. If there is no anomaly, then we can be pretty sure that melting happened in the uppermost mantle. So how does this fit to Kimballites? And that's sort of where this study comes in. Sort of, we have taken samples from most Kimballites of sub-Saharan Africa, going from Tanzania, Angola, Botswana, all the way into South Africa and Lesotho, including also Namibia. You see this here. And we have reconstructed their positions relative to this African LLSVP that you see here again. So that's your plume generation zone at the core mantle boundary. And you can see that the samples that we have selected sort of cluster around the margin and then also go into the interior. That's just another way of showing the samples. And zooming in here, the samples sort of going from the margin all the way across the western wing. And then we also have samples from Tanzania that's on the eastern wing of the African LSVP. That's the list of Kimberlite localities that made it into our study. That's sort of the Champions League of African Kimberlites, if you want to call it like that. And first we have done the basics, like we have just measured the neodymium and hafnium isotope compositions. I showed you a diagram like this earlier. This is sort of global Kimberlites here in gray, the gray dots, and our samples are now all in red and blue. That's the samples that made it into the study. And it's a fairly good representation of what we know about global Kimberlite magmatism, sort of clustering around that crosshair again. And just zooming in into this systematic, sort of we're quite confident that we sort of have a good representation of our samples. And that's what our tungsten isotope evidence looks like. So we have seen this diagram earlier when I spoke about the ocean island basalts from Mantle et al. You see again the mu-182 value at 0, the gray bar, which is sort of the analytical uncertainty. And then you see our samples. Sort of those are 18 localities, many samples that have been duplicated, and not a single African Kimberlite picks up in tungsten isotope anomaly. I've just replotted some of these OIB data from earlier studies. You see here that they tend to pick up the negative anomalies that I mentioned earlier. So we don't really see that, which means there's no real evidence that Kimberlites come from the lower mantle, from the core mantle boundary. And because earlier I was talking about Letseng, if you just look at this diagram, which is just an enlargement, Letseng sits here. And for Letseng, we have taken 5 samples and measured them over and over again. And the average value is essentially 0 ± 3 or 2, I don't remember. So no anomalous tungsten, it's pretty normal, and we only need a normal upper mantle source to explain this. So that leads me to the preferred model. And now we get a little bit into petrology, away from the isotopes. That's just a temperature pressure diagram. Here we go sort of from the Earth's surface again down. This is sort of the base of the lithosphere, and here we are in the convecting upper mantle. And that's temperature going up this way. And here we use sort of experiments from the literature, just plotting melting experiments that are done in high pressure petrology labs. And the blue colors here, they show melts that have less than 25% silica and are packed full with carbon dioxide and water. So that's your kimberlitic carbonatitic melt. And the red symbols here, those are melts that have more than 40% silica. That's sort of basaltic and komatiitic. So we can see if we want to make these kimberlitic melts, we actually don't need extreme temperatures. So we can just use normal convecting mantle geotherms, like 1300 degrees C up to 1500 degrees C. That's normal convecting upper mantle to explain these melts. All we need is to have oxidizing conditions, and we need volatiles like carbon dioxide and water to make kimberlites. If you want to make certain types of basalts, like in the ocean islands or also the komatiites, you really need the plume temperatures past 1500 degrees C to essentially create these high silica melts. So that's the petrogenetic difference between a kimberlite and, let's say, high magnesium basalt. Sort of it's really the temperature and also a little bit the pressure that controls the difference. So to bring this into some cartoon, this is borrowed from Steve Shiry's work from a few years back and slightly redrawn. We would argue that all we kind of know about kimberlites and also now the new tungsten isotope data is that they're best formed here at the bottom of the craton in this red area. Sort of, it's not within the cratonic lithosphere. It plays also a role later to modify the kimberlites, but the ultimate source sits somewhere just below in the convecting upper mantle. And that's convenient because here we can produce low degree partial melts that are CO2 fluxed melts, and we melt peridotite at high pressure. That makes the difference. The high pressure is important to keep the degree of melting low at low temperatures. So if we have the pressure low, we also make basalts, but we need the high pressure to suppress melting essentially. And we don't need temperatures that are plume-like. We can deal with fairly regular upper mantle temperatures, and the lithosphere-asthenosphere boundary fits this best. That's where we sample most of the cratonic diamonds. And then every so often there is sort of the ultra deep diamond that's being sourced from subducted material here all the way to the transition zone is being brought in by convection. And potentially these ultra deep diamonds have already an Archean origin, and they were just sort of attached from below against the cratonic lithosphere. They still record the high pressure inclusions, but they have been actually lingering around here for quite some while and then get picked up by the kimberlite. So nothing really needs to come from below here, which is also geodynamically quite unrealistic. So how do we get these melts up? And that's the trick, and that's where the plate tectonics come in. And I think Antando showed that diagram earlier in his talk. That's sort of an exercise we did where we just took for the African plate, the African kimberlites here. You can view this as a histogram. Yeah, that's sort of kimberlite incidences. And then we have taken in red the African plate velocity. That's the red curve, and averaged this out. And you can see that over the last 300 million years, from the main Pangea phase, or Gondwana phase, if you wish to say so, to the Pangea breakup, the African plate velocity on average has been slowing down, but then we always get these sort of accelerating and decelerating phases. So essentially sort of jogging around, and sort of depending on what's happening in the ocean basins around it, the velocity changes. And what we have said in this paper here from 3 years back now is that especially for the two main pulses of kimberlites in Africa around 90 million years, and then this one here at 120, 130 million years, that whenever the African plate is accelerating and changing directions, that's when we can pump the kimberlite melt through from the base of the craton, from the uppermost convecting mantle to the surface. If we don't have this, we don't see kimberlites, and the melts are probably sitting somewhere at the steps. They just have no means to come to the surface. So it's essentially controlled by plate motions, whether we see pulses of kimberlites or not. And just a couple of take-home points, keep it sort of simple, it's almost weekend. So I would say that the first high-precision tungsten 182 data for African kimberlites do not support lower mantle origins for these melts. If we resort to petrology, and I showed you the temperatures and the pressures of melt generation, an upper convecting upper mantle is just doing fine, and this is conform with all the other isotopes, with Craig Smith's earlier work on strontium neodymium isotopes and so on. So this can be the ultimate source to Kimballites. And the rare ultra deep diamonds are likely just stranded below the cratonic lithosphere. They're just hanging somewhere at this interface between the craton and the convecting mantle and can be picked up by Kimballites from there. And the last point is just sort of a quick disclaimer. When I've had that now a few times when talking about plumes or mentioning the word plume and saying something against it or whatever, people tend to be quite heated and unreasonably angry. So I'm just saying, please control your temper when you ask questions, if you have some, because in the end of the day, it's just a bunch of rocks that we talk about. And I think the truth is probably more like this. So if you wish to say it like that, there's a million ways of how these things can be explained, but there is no reason to sort of lose control on temper. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Before we take any questions, Patella had one in the chat and he wants to know, is the size of the core constant or is there a chance it might be expanding at a slow rate?
The size, I'm not so sure. What's happening is the core is crystallizing. The inner core is solid and the outer core is a liquid, sort of liquid metal with a few other components. And the outer core is still crystallizing, meaning the inner core is still growing. Sort of, it's probably not a sharp interface that is always like this. It's probably very similar to the lithosphere-stenosphere boundary. It grows, it shrinks, it regrows. So it's an interface rather than a sharp boundary. But I'm not a geophysicist, so about if there's really some form of growth, I'm not so sure about this. I would say no, but definitely not a sharp boundary, rather an interface.
Great, thank you. Yep. Any other questions for Sebastian?
One from me, Sebastian. It's Craig here.
Yes, I can hear your voice. Yeah.
There's a lot of argument, which we won't go into here, about relating chrome pore megacrust suites in particular to the source regions of group 1 kimberlites and group 2 for that matter. And assuming that that is the case, that is reflective of the source, has any tungsten isotope work been done or planned for on the megacrust suites?
No, hasn't. When we started this work, I wanted to work with megacrysts exclusively because of avoiding all the other issues with Kimballites, as you can see in this picture here, that it's a little bit of a mess in most cases. The problem is the tungsten concentrations are too low. And then analytically, megacrysts tend to be quite titanium rich. And titanium is, for the analytical work for tungsten, a big no-go, because one of the chemical procedures to purify the tungsten is to get rid of all the titanium. And if you work with megacrysts, that will be a huge effort and adding blank. So it's analytically impossible to work with megacrysts, but we considered that. But it would have been the more elegant way of doing it. So, but I guess in another 10 years, we have better chemistry procedures. We can remove the titanium more efficiently and so on. And even the chromium, all these elements are just sort of disturbing the tungsten analysis in the end.
Thanks, Sebastian. Do we have other questions, comments? Going once, going twice.
I've got a
Solved.
question. Okay.
Oh, go.
Kimberlite eruptions were apparently so rapid. Why is that? I mean, if you were standing on the surface of the earth and you saw a kimberlite erupt, what would you see?
You would see the same as an alkali basalt making a Mla field anywhere else in the world. It would be the same pretty much. That's also one of the misconceptions. The ascent rates of kimberlitic melts are not necessarily faster than sort of an alkali-rich basalt. So this all goes back to sort of to make this more exciting, I guess, as a research direction and to sell the diamonds. But in reality, most kimberlites react out in the lithosphere. So we know this now from all the Olivine work, that essentially something that's almost like a carbonatite turns into a kimberlite just by reacting within the lithosphere. So there's a lot of melt-rock interaction that slows the melt down in the end. And at surface, I mean, if you've seen some of the diatreme volcanoes that are created by basalts in Australia or in the Eifel in Germany or Alaska, they're pretty much volcanologically speaking the same as a kimberlite eruption. The only difference is that we don't have a modern analog for kimberlites, except for maybe Ikwisi Hills in Tanzania, where we see lava coming out happily without getting fragmented. So you can also see kimberlite lava coming out very calmly, but there's only one locality where we really can see something like that. So the next youngest kimberlites would be then already 30 million years old. And we can't study it that well. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. I'll have to think about it. Thank you.
Nature is quite simple. Like one should always go for the simplest explanation and not for the most sensational. That's likely to be wrong.
Okay, well, so my puzzle is the traditional explanation is that you're getting these lumps of mantle being brought to the surface, and that it must have been rapid, because if it wasn't rapid, then they would have been unstable and they would have joined the melt or something like that.
Yeah, see, if you
look how I was brought up, that's what I was taught.
Yeah, that's if you put all this back together here in this image, there you have your mantle xenoliths. So it's most of the xenoliths are still quite rare. We are spoiled by localities like Kimberley. If you go to other cratons, getting this amount of large xenoliths is quite rare. Most kimberlites look like this, and all the xenoliths have been essentially disaggregated. So there is an element of slowing down and reacting. And why the size of the xenoliths at Kimberley are so big, that's one of the big puzzles, I have to say, because we don't see that very often elsewhere. To find a xenolith of that size in Canada, that would probably be worth a news article or something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question from Merrily. So is there no relationship between kimberlite formation and the occurrence of LLSVP? When and how did the LLSVP form?
Well, there's different theories, right, about how the LLSVPs form. Sort of the theory that I've picked up on for today's talk is that they are early Earth features. They are there since essentially the core mantle separation. They're sort of a leftover of the core mantle separation, which is within the first 60 million years of Earth history. Sort of. Then there are other ideas that 80–90% of the LLSVPs are essentially slab graveyards. It's subducted oceanic lithosphere that makes it all the way down and then gets accumulated in these two antipodal LLSVPs. That's sort of the other idea. But compositionally, we don't really know what the LLSVP is. It's being detected by many different groups, different techniques. So clearly there's something sitting there, but compositionally what it is, that is still a big mystery. And the Kimballites, yeah, sort of the arguments that have been made by groups like Davies et al. 2015 is that the African LSVP has a strong north-south elongation, and it's huge. It's sort of the size of a quarter planet. And Africa, with a lot of cratonic lithospheres, sort of 50–60% of Africa's lithospheres are Archean Proterozoic. It's just a coincidence that sort of for the last 200–300 million years, it has been drifting over it, sort of. And pretty much the Kimballites form below the craton, and that's the link. And it's not because it's sitting over the LLSVP. And the other thing, if you want to get melt up from, let's say, almost 3,000 kilometers, that is physically impossible, especially if it's a low degree melt. And it would take 100 million years for that melt to come up for those 2,500 kilometers. And that means in the meantime, the continent has already drifted away. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So most melting on this planet happens within the upper 200 kilometers and not the stuff that's happening close to the core mantle boundary. We rarely ever see at surface. An ocean island basalt or a flood basalt province, that's probably your best bet to get something from down there.
Great. And there's a follow-up question. Are any of the ultra-high pressure diamonds certainly Archean in age?
That's the thing. There's one age that exists from Evan Smith from the Kimberlite conference abstract from a few years back, where they picked up a 2.5 billion year model age in some of these metal inclusions. That one was also from Letseng, as a matter of fact. So in this case, the only one we have gives an Archean age. But how robust that is in the long term, if we get more ages, not sure. But the easiest way to bring these ultra deep diamonds up is actually some form of intensified mantle convection early on in Earth history. And the cratons formed, essentially, it's part of the craton formation process. They at some point see ultra high pressure, but they are brought up very quickly when we start to grow the cratonic root, and then they get trapped somewhere in there. So that's the easiest way to explain this. And one should not forget a lot of these inclusions actually retrogressed, meaning they are not what we reconstruct. They are using this for pressure estimates. They are decomposed into low pressure minerals, and then we just back reconstruct this. So which means there is a lot of ambiguity what they actually were and what pressure they record. And somebody like Andy Moore would be more qualified to talk about this, but if I remember correctly, he never bought into this whole super deep stuff. For him, it's all part of the lithosphere, and I would probably agree with him.
First, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this morning. I think we've seen some really good talks. And of course, I'm a little bit biased to Kimberlites myself, but there's also a lot going on with geoheritage as well, as we heard. It's also an illustration of the kinds of projects that the REI Fund can help support, which is namely a large variety of things. Everything from geoheritage to student field expenses and so forth. So keep your eyes peeled for the application forms that come around usually in the last quarter of the year for the following year. The REI Fund has about 4 to 5 million rands in assets in it, and we typically disperse 300,000 or 400,000 rands a year, depending on the projects we receive. So keep those proposals coming. It's resulted in assisting some really good science, we think. With that, I'd like to invite people back again next year. We'll probably repeat the exercise and see how we go.